r/AskReddit. What is the scariest story you know that is 100% true? In my town in the early 90s there was a notorious serial killer that had all of Canada on watch. My wife's mother, years and years before I knew them, had been home alone while her husband was in England doing tree surgeon work, arborist. She was in her laundry room when a man walked up from her basement, completely scaring her. She freaked out and said, "What the hell are you doing here?" He said he was friends with her husband and was just coming to see if he was here. Apparently he told him he could just walk in, which she knew was bullshit. She was smart enough to tell him that he was just at the store and would be back any minute. He said he would wait outside for him. As soon as he left she called the police, but he was long gone by the time they got here. 2 weeks later, the killer was caught, his mugshot put on TV, and it was the guy in her house. This is a hometown story that stayed with me. It happened literally right around the corner from where I grew up, maybe a 2-minute drive away. Judy Kirby murdered 6 children and 1 adult by intentionally driving the wrong way on a divided highway in an attempt to commit suicide. She had been hospitalized for depression, but had also just ended a relationship with her ex-husband's brother and was by some reports involved in drug trafficking and fearing an imminent arrest. She picked up her sister's son, who was celebrating his 10th birthday that day. She then loaded her 3 children into the car, supposedly to pick up a gift for the nephew. Instead, she went missing with the carload of kids. A short time later, calls started coming into 911 about a car going the wrong way down the highway at a high rate of speed. They made it about 90 seconds before a head-on collision with another vehicle, driven by a father with 2 children and another child along for the ride. The crash annihilated both vehicles. The only survivors were Kirby herself and the child who was along for the ride in the other car. There were pieces of children all over the highway. She was sentenced to 215 years in prison. I'll tell you one that happened to me, or rather, I was witness to. One night, I was out at a bar with a friend I was visiting in New Rochelle, New York. We went outside for a cigarette, and a car came flying past the bar. The car burned through a red light and started going up this hill that was on a curve. We watched as he veered over the double yellow and smashed head on with another car coming from the other direction. Both cars' hind ends lifted up, then slammed down. The car that was driving correctly burst into flames. I ran inside and grabbed the fire extinguisher, then yelled to the bartender to call 911 and say there has been an accident. My friend, a few other patrons, and me ran to the cars. Now, I used to think this was a fictional trope, but I was pretty drunk before this happened, and I swear it sobered me up instantly. I tried spraying the fire, but it did nothing. The fumes and heat were awful, and all we could do was stand back. The worst part was, and this will haunt me forever, was that the woman in the burning car was screaming as she died. My god, it was the worst sound ever. The fire department came and put the fire out. The police took us back to the bar and took statements. I found out the next day in the news that the car that was not speeding was being driven by a young woman coming home late from work. She was a block away from home, and I think she was either newly married or a new mother. The rotten motherfucker driving the other car was some rich drunk cocksucker. He lost a leg, but otherwise was physically unharmed. I have no clue if he did time, as I left to go back home a day or so later. I'm trying to find a link for the news story, but I can't, as this was maybe 6 or 7 years back. I remember it being reported on Lohan Channel 12 News. John List killed his whole family, wife, mother, daughter and 2 sons. He meticulously planned the whole thing, cancelling all delivery services, excusing the kids from school, and even turned the air conditioning as low as possible to preserve the bodies for as long as possible. After he killed them all, he placed the bodies in sleeping bags and lined them up. He then wrote a letter to his pastor explaining why he had to kill them. He then leaves and isn't heard from again. 18 years later he's remarried and doing the same job as before, but this time he doesn't have any children. He's finally arrested after a tip was given to the FBI. crazy thing is that, because he planned it so well, the bodies weren't discovered until a month after the murders, so he had a huge head start and essentially started a new life in the same career and was heavily involved in a new church down in Virginia. Took 18 years to capture him. My dad and some friends got drunk and went for a drive on some back roads and were going as fast as the truck would go as teenagers. My dad was slightly less drunk than the others and eventually demanded they let him get out. They pulled over and he and one other girl got out. He and the girl started walking to town while the other three sped off in the opposite direction. Well, less than a mile up the road from where they got out is an extremely sharp turn, which they missed and hit a tree going pretty close to triple digits miles per hour. 2 of them died on impact and the only reason the third survived is because they crashed in front of a house that 2 doctors lived in. The survivor was paralyzed and lost his leg and part of his arm and was in the hospital for 8 months before dying. This was in the '60s, so medical care wasn't what it is today. When I first got my permit, my dad took me to that corner to explain the importance of safe driving. It gave me goosebumps about how close he was to being in the truck. He said that the dad of the driver got what remained of the truck to be hung up in the center of town for months after to be a warning to all. Years ago, my now husband worked for an industrial laundry company in their head office when a PR disaster happened that also mentally screwed up a number of people. Their company collected laundry from large hospitals and medical type businesses, egg care homes etc, and cleaned them. You can imagine the sort of heavy duty cleaning, bleaching, boiling etc needed to remove those sort of biological contaminants. One day a laundry cart went through the usual bleaching, boiling cycle before it dropped out into a conveyor belt to be sorted for drying/pressing when there was a horrid scream. A small newborn baby's body was discovered tangled up amongst the sheets. It had been cooked. The laundry workers were distraught. The whole place had to be shut down. Police called in. The laundry tracked back to the hospital to discover what happened. It turns out thankfully in some ways, stillborn baby had been left in the cot waiting to be taken down to the hospital mortuary after the parents had said their goodbyes and covered it with a blanket, but somehow one of the nurses hadn't realized, just on shift, was the best guess, so just grabbed up all the linen out the cot and off the bed in the delivery room with the body bundled inside and emptied it into the laundry hamper/trolley thing. The other nurses/parents assumed the baby had been collected by the mortuary to be stored awaiting their funeral decisions. The laundry was found not to be to blame, but the parents were devastated and the hospital took a lot of flack. The poor laundry workers who discovered the body ended up being given counseling before eventually quitting. The laundry did amend its practice to individually emptying each laundry hamper into the industrial machines instead of just tipping them in, to stop anything like that happening again. Edit. Just found it in the newspaper. Turns out I misremembered the how of getting into the laundry basket slightly wrong. Have you heard of the Nazi so bad that other Nazis, in particular fellow SS Nazis, constantly tried to get him and his unit disbanded and arrested? No? Well, his name was Oscar de la Hoya, and his unit was nicknamed the Black Hunters or the de la Hoya Brigade. Oscar de la Hoya was an early adopter of the Nazi Party. He had been thrown in jail before for being a pedophile. Eventually, when World War II broke out and healthy ideal Germans were dying in droves on the Eastern Front, Oscar's old pal Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, granted him a command of a unit made up originally of German poachers and eventually German criminals being held in civilian jails/camps and military criminals. His unit was essentially designated as a rearguard unit meant to hunt down enemy partisans, or in most cases civilians in occupied countries. Oscar de la Hoya SS unit was responsible for many atrocities. Some atrocities so barbaric and bad other SS units reported him and his unit for atrocities. A few examples, which have been popularized in film, include taking an entire village in Belarus and putting them in a church, locking the doors, and setting the church ablaze. Anyone who tried to escape was shot by machine guns and rifles. This unit raped, tortured, and murdered its way through Eastern and Central Europe. During the Warsaw Uprising, they were sent to help squelch the uprising. one of their atrocities committed was going into a children's hospital, telling the nurses and staff that they were there to secure the church. Okay. Once the church was secured, they raped the female staff and some of the wounded and sick female children victims, and then went around shooting everyone. If anyone was found to have survived, they were bayoneted. These guys were so horrible that other Nazis looked down their noses at them and constantly filed complaints and reports against them, but with no real success. Thankfully, by the end of the war, this unit was destroyed, and its leaders and criminal soldiers were hunted down like rabid animals. Told this here before, but once more. My friend had this neighbor who was a retired mechanic. They lived on some properties with large front lawns and long driveways. His neighbor had a couple derelict cars parked up near his garage that he took parts from occasionally. This neighbor of his started hearing noises while sitting in his living room, coming from his front yard. Every time he'd go to the window, there would be nothing there. He assumed it was a raccoon or a coyote or whatever. He kept hearing the noise, so he'd go outside to look around, but would find nothing. He'd put out traps and occasionally catch something, yet the noise persisted. Soon, he started claiming that he was hearing voices coming from the front yard, like whispering. He'd go outside and look around the perimeter of his property, but would find nothing. It was persistent, so he'd started calling the cops. Every time the cops came and looked around and would find nothing. So they told him he needed to stop calling them for this and perhaps get a security camera or whatever. So this guy thought he was losing his mind. One summer evening he couldn't sleep, so he went to the back patio to smoke a cigarette. Suddenly, he heard voices coming from the front of his house. He put his cig out and snuck around to the front and got there just in time to see the doors to his derelict conversion van silently shut. He ran back to the backyard and went inside his home and called the police to tell them what he had seen. The police arrived and approached cold, that is without lights/sirens, and when they approached the van, the doors swung open and a bunch of people ran out in every direction. Upon searching the van, the cops found syringes and paraphernalia and determined that people were shooting up in there. It happened to my mom's friend a couple of years back. She was driving on the highway in the middle of nowhere, as in far away from any town. Suddenly a car that is passing on her left steers fully to the right in front of her, causing her to brake and steer very rashly. This obviously causes her to lose control and crash against a tree. She passed out, and some time later, she couldn't really tell how much time passed. A group of Brazilians, all of this happened in Portugal, came to her rescue and told her things like, "Don't move, we are calling an ambulance, just hang on there etc." She eventually passes out again, and about 2 hours later someone else comes and starts helping her again, and eventually the ambulance and her husband arrive. She tells them that some other people have been there before, but the guy that found her says no one was there. When they checked the trunk, everything had been stolen, including computer, camera etc. She later said that she remembers thinking the car that made her crash had been following her for a while and driving a little too close. Make of that what you want. Sorry for my English. The Battle of Osowiec Fortress, 1915. German troops attempted to gas the Russian defenders out, as the fort had been a thorn in the side of the Germans since the outbreak of war. The gas succeeded in killing almost 3 whole companies. The Germans then advanced across the fields, expecting the fortress to be empty and an easy victory. From within the fortress, Russian troops emerged, coughing up blood and lung fragments, covered in bandages made up as improvised gas masks as well as chemical burns. They returned rifle and light artillery fire at the advancing Germans. The German troops didn't bother firing back, as they just ran back to their lines. Their commanders claimed they are already dead. Give it 20 minutes and go take the place, to which the soldiers remarked, "It is not men protecting that place." But the devil Osowiec fortress never fell during the war, as when the German troops went back months after, there was already fresh defenders. I know this story is much different to the ones other people have said, but it's the one I could think of as truly terrifying. One night about 2 years ago, I believe it was spring, and it was about 9 or 10 at night. A bit of context: my mother is a photographer, and she has one of those big expensive cameras. Now I was just sitting in my room playing Xbox with my buddies, and I heard the commotion of my family in the doorway to the backyard, the kind of commotion of people gawking. So I went out to see what it was all about. I go to my dad and ask what it is, and he says there's something in our backyard and my mom is out there trying to get pictures, but her flash isn't working, and she's right at the fence trying to get pictures, and all of a sudden the flash goes off and lights up the pitch black yard, and right in front of my mom is a bear stood up on its back legs, just standing there. By the time the flash was done, my mom was nearly in the house. This reminds me of a story I was told by a biologist studying jaguars. Back in the days of film cameras, she had set up a motion control still camera in a cave, hoping to catch a pic of the elusive jaguar in that area. When she finally developed the role, she got one photo of a startled armadillo, 22 more photos of said armadillo really enjoying the motion controlled flash, and the last photo was of nothing but a jaguar's glowing eyes, because the snap happy armadillo had killed the flash batteries with all his self eyes. I've posted about this before, I believe, but we'll give a shorter version. Basically, a few friends and I went to a mountain house my family owns in North Carolina. The house is very isolated on the mountain, and in the middle of nowhere practically. Our house sits on like 10 acres of property, and the rest of the land past it is just dense Appalachian woods and mountains 4 miles. Friends and I decided to go hiking a bit deep into the woods, because why the hell not? In the middle of nowhere in the mountains we find a foxhole-sized hole in the ground, filled with children's shoes, some really old looking, some pretty new looking. I've never been that deep into the woods since then, and don't really go to our house there anymore. I've heard of serial killers and such in the Appalachians, so I'd DK if we found a dumping ground for one of them, or what, but it seriously creeped us out. A bunch of girls in my friend group decided to have a night out, and ended up at the local gay club. I can't remember why I didn't go, but I'm sort of glad I wasn't there. However, I also wish I had been, so I cold helped. Anyway, they noticed a girl on the dance floor who looked super out of place. She had sweat pants and a t-shirt on, and wasn't wearing makeup, and had her hair in a ponytail. She also had a backpack on. Basically, the exact opposite of typical club attire, and not at all what someone would usually wear to this place. They said that she seemed very dazed as well, and more importantly, there was a very large man grabbing her and grinding on her, and she was just kind of standing there letting it happen. One of my friends tried approaching her to ask if she was alright, but the guy spoke for her and insisted that he was her boyfriend, and that she just had too much to drink, but that she was okay. Everyone was suspicious, but at that point there wasn't much else they could do, so they just kept an eye on the two of them. Eventually the guy left the dance floor to go to the bar, and my friend was able to talk to this girl again. She said that she was extremely out of it, and that it seemed more likely that she had been drugged rather than just drunk. The girl managed to convey that she didn't know the man she was with and wanted to leave. So my friend grabbed her and made for the exit, but not before this guy came back. He immediately flipped out, got right in my friend's face, and started screaming at her. It escalated to the point that he eventually swung at my friend, who just barely dodged the punch. Thankfully, someone else had went and found a security guard, and they were able to prevent this guy from hurting anyone, meaning that my friends and the girl were all able to leave safely. She was still super messed up when they left, so nobody could get the full story out of her, but she did say that the guy had been following her around town all day. The really scary part is that the bar staff couldn't technically do anything other than throw this guy out after my friends had left. One of them called the cops and gave them a description of the guy, but they said they couldn't really do much other than be on the lookout for him. So chances are that he's still out there somewhere and may do this again. I used to run the boilers in a dough building. Apparently at some point in the 80s, 3 people were murdered over involvement in a big VCR theft. VCRs meant for the school system had apparently been stolen out of this warehouse. It was an inside job. Something went wrong. The head custodian was found shot to death. and later the bodies of the other 2 were reported buried in Monticello but wordies. They had first been incinerated. In the boilers I was in charge of operating and maintaining. There were 3 operational boilers, and 1 that wasn't in service, no clue which one was supposedly used, but when you're firing them up, you're typically the only person in the building. Not a single day went by that I fired them up and didn't wonder which one was used. But that wasn't what gave me the real heebie-jeebies. You have to clean the interior of these boilers really well, otherwise the fire won't transfer heat to the water very efficiently, especially with ash 6 oil. These boilers would build up a lot of soot. You have to suit up in a Tyvek suit, wear a mask, and climb right into the firebox. I found myself staring down the business end of that burner many times, wondering what that panic would feel like. I'm reasonably sure these people were dead before getting put in the boiler though. Once, I was actually in one boiler while another one was running. The valve that isolated my boiler from the main steam line wasn't holding, and by the time I realized how warm it was getting, it was enough to panic trying to lift myself up and belly crawl through the small opening. The metal was almost too hot to keep my hands on for long. Definitely creepy experience, considering the history of that boiler room. I moved into another town. I was surprised by people who looked as they knew me, even though I saw them for the very first time. And everyone around was so rude, despite of all other sources telling how friendly people there were. I was also greeted by "Oh no, you again." In one place, where I went for the first time, I was looking for a room for rent, and one of the owners told me that he won't rent it to me because my co-tenants saw me following and stalking them. I was like, what the fuck? Am I doing things and forgetting? Is something wrong with my mental health? Then, I went abroad for 3 months. No such thing was happening there. Everything was normal. I thought, guess it's just a local culture. They do that to get rid of newcomers. Once I returned, I went to a fast food to leave my CV. The guy said, "You were here a month ago, and it hasn't changed. We aren't recruiting." Right, I was on another continent. I couldn't have just bought 2 airplane tickets, spent several days, and just forgetting about it. And my bank account wouldn't forget. Anyway, that's when I started to understand what's going on. And then one day, I finally saw myself on the CCTV, trying to steal something. Right. Stealing, following people and stalking, and being disliked. Makes sense. There was some thief who looked exactly like me, even had similar hairstyle, which was in fashion around. As of now, I already know of 2 guys who look identically like me. Years ago when I was 8, my family lived in this big weird house kind of on the edge of a small town. The school district was in the middle of a big restructuring, so even though we were only a couple grades apart, my brother and I went to different schools and took different buses. This left me as the last person to leave in the morning and the first person to get home in the afternoon, which meant it was my job to make sure all the lights were off and the door was locked. One morning I noticed the basement door was open and the light was on, so before I left I turned off the light and closed the door. When I got home that afternoon, the light was on and the door was open again. I just assumed that I'd forgotten to actually take care of it when I noticed it in the morning, so I went over to turn off the light and close the door. When I got to the top of the basement stairs I looked, and there was a big shadowy male figure towards the bottom of the staircase. I freaked out, slammed the door, and pushed a bunch of boxes against it, and then went and hid in my closet. For months I didn't tell my family because I was positive what I had seen was a ghost and didn't think anyone would believe me. Then about a year after that incident, my mom and her boyfriend realized that small amounts of money had been going missing for months, totaling around $800-900, but never more than $60 at once. So we all walked around the house with flashlights trying to figure out how they could have gotten in. Turns out some creep was climbing in through a small hole in the outside of the house, shimmying through a crawl space, then coming up into the house through the basement. Realizing I had been alone in the house with him on at least one occasion was one of the worst, most terrifying moments I've ever had. This one terrifies me. I'm going to be purposely kinda vague about this, since I'm figuring the events in this story are rare. The events are also mostly speculative, since there weren't any witnesses. I say this to spare you all the multiple probably yes and most likely yes that would otherwise be in this post. This is how it was told to me. A family member of mine is friends with a man, middle-aged, whose wife sadly died while taking their dog out for a walk through a rural area they were visiting. They had driven up to a farm along the road and gotten out when the dog tore from her grip and ran off. She ran after it to the back of the barn, where the huge open dung cistern was. The farmer wasn't home, so when he came back later in the day, he found her car and thought it weird that a strange car had just been left there, doors open, with no people noticeably nearby. He went around searching for his unexpected visitors, and eventually found them. What he found was something I had never even imagined before hearing of this. The dog had fallen into the cistern of deep liquid waste from the farm animals. The edges on the cistern were way too high up to reach from liquid surface level, and the woman must have panicked because she had jumped in after the dog to save it, and that's where her life slowly and brutally came to an end. The fumes that accumulate from that much dung are very toxic. The woman, after being unable to get back out, had lost consciousness and drowned, along with her dog, in a pool of cow shit. I can't imagine a worse way to die. I think about it now and then and hope that no one will ever die like that again. Poor souls. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.